conference. It's really exciting to see so much excellent research being done in the area of new business models to address the wicked sustainability issues and, of course, to address the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's quite remarkable to see how far the field has come since the first New Business Models conference in 2016. The research and papers on new business models has grown substantially since I first published my PhD research in 2008, which developed a sustainability business model, which is what I called it back then. And we've seen a proliferation of papers since 2016, as Van Bommel and colleagues found in their research. They found that over 80% of the articles in this field were published after 2016. So as a community, I think we've come a long way in understanding how we can transform business models to embrace sustainability. And along the way, we've come up with lots of terms and definitions to describe what constitutes a sustainable business model, as well as frameworks to explain these sustainable business models. And we've studied many examples of new business models that seek to reduce negative social and environmental impacts and increase positive outcomes. And these are just a few examples of how different sustainable business models have been conceptualized over the years, from social enterprises to circular economy, closed loop, biomimicry, and the business models that focus on a purpose wider than making money, like the B Corps, and of course the regenerative business model, which has only more recently been researched. So as this conference questions, how far have we come in accelerating the practical implementation of what we have learnt over the years in different contexts to enable all kinds of organisations to undertake business model innovation for sustainability, involving multiple stakeholders for transition towards a future fit society? And so what I'd like to talk about this morning is an emerging ecosystem of actors and intermediaries to support this transition towards this future fit society. Fred Dalman from Warwick University and I've been researching what we're calling the purpose ecosystem. So the purpose ecosystem seeks to promote wider systems change by driving and supporting the creation of purpose-driven businesses, those organisations that define the purpose of their existence beyond profit maximisation. The purpose ecosystem facilitates businesses to adopt new business models, connects and brings together purpose-driven actors from multiple areas, and seeks to educate new and potential businesses to be social and environmental change makers. The purpose ecosystem is a loosely self-organised community of organisations and independent entities, including for-profits, non-for-profits, NGOs, charities, social movements, consultancies, and stakeholder coalitions. This is just an example from the UK, which was developed by an organisation called Regenerate, and they've been mapping purpose ecosystem in the UK, and currently they've mapped over 300 organisations, and they continue to update this map of the purpose ecosystem. Although highly diverse, the groups in the ecosystem are united by a strong desire to transform the way businesses operate, helping them become more purpose-driven and connecting them more closely to the issues underlying or represented by the Sustainable Development Goals. We're interested in understanding how the purpose ecosystem actors use a broad concept of purpose as a lever to drive sustainability transformations. The purpose ecosystem is potentially an innovative form of governance to accelerate business models aligned with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So members of the purpose ecosystem deploy often overlapping approaches, including a focus on challenging the roles of the financial sector, developing organisational targets and strategic aspirations aligned with Earth system science, such as the planetary boundaries on the left-hand side, and more recently, Kate Rayworth's work with the donut that she created, that she took from the planetary boundaries and then actually fleshed it out with more social and other aspects. They propose new forms of corporate governance, business models and leadership mindsets, all conducted under this umbrella of changing the purpose of business. So we sort of classified the members of the purpose ecosystem loosely into different groupings in our own research. We looked at, for example, funding organisations that share a belief that the market-led economy has more to offer than purely financial returns. They use impact investing strategies, for example, to influence the reframing of purpose and focus on returns from a social and environmental perspective. There's a wide-ranging coalition of organisations offering advice on sustainability targets, measurements, and how to integrate them into business operations based on scientific evidence. And then there's a diverse group of business purpose change agents working with senior executives, board directors, sometimes the whole of the organisations across a range of activities aimed at changing mindsets, reworking business models and equipping companies with the tools they need to repurpose their organisations. In our research, Fred and I were interested in understanding why and how do actors in the purpose ecosystem use the concept of purpose as a means to framing, mobilising and enabling purpose-driven businesses and thus to drive wider systemic change. In the first instance, we explored how do purpose ecosystem actors interact with other purpose ecosystem stakeholders to help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We found that they take on multiple roles to engage with and influence other stakeholders in the purpose ecosystem. The Sustainable Development Goals provide purpose ecosystem actors with a clear framework and a shared language with which to pitch their stakeholder engagement methods. There's an understanding that while the Sustainable Development Goals ultimately matter, achieving them requires changing the nature of business more generally so that wider aims, such as those covered by the goals, can be taken into consideration by business in the first instance. So moving beyond profit is therefore generally seen as essential to making businesses appreciate their wider systemic connections. We identified 6 key roles that the actors currently play in the purpose ecosystem: capacity builder, communicator, collaborator, enabler, change maker, and influencer. As capacity builders or conveners, they bring together partners, advisors, solution providers, and others, and equip companies with tools and resources to drive social change. They engage in some form of communication activities to inspire, enable, and connect, the words of the people we spoke to. The aim is to raise awareness, promote, inform, and educate about the importance of changing purpose in business aligned with achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is a critical lever for changing the way that people think in order to get business in a mindset of thinking about a different way of doing business. And I am actually drawing from quotes from the people we spoke to. They actively seek to collaborate with each other and other stakeholders in a wide variety of ways, chiefly with the aim to connect all businesses and connect people with people and people with resources. So this is just an example of the first bit of research that we did, and this is actually just an example of some of the purpose ecosystem actors that we spoke to and their connections with each other. and then also their connections outside of what we've identified as the intermediaries, if you like. So you can see a lot of connections with each other, but also a lot of connection with other stakeholders that are part of the ecosystem, if you like, but not the ones that we spoke to. So it's just sort of an example. So building on and leveraging the roles of capacity builder and communicator, enablers amplify and share knowledge, tools, and other resources to help businesses think about their business through a purpose lens. Enablers help businesses to shift their thinking and business strategy from just looking at return to shareholders to actually looking at how they can address social and environmental issues. Purpose ecosystem actors see themselves as catalysts or agents of quality transformative change, creating a movement of actors and stakeholders, as well as influencing those people that have the biggest impact, such as senior people in large corporates. We found two types of influencer roles, one aimed at influencing business and investor behaviour through financing mechanisms, and the other designed, excuse me, to influence policymakers to support purpose-driven businesses. So taken together, we argue that the purpose ecosystem potentially plays an important role in helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by focusing attention chiefly on the importance of creating partnerships for goals, SDG 17. While many of the actors directly target specific goals, the added value of the purpose ecosystem is linked to SDG 17, creating partnerships for the goals, as an orientation point within a wider framework designed to achieve transformative change towards sustainable development. Our findings suggest that unlike more established and self-governed multi-stakeholder initiatives on sustainability, one of the potential strengths of this purpose ecosystem may be its lack of formalised coordination. In fact, the shared focus on changing the purpose of business enables a wide variety of actors and their stakeholders to collaborate and contribute to these shared ambitions through their respective approaches and niche innovations, rather than perhaps being constrained by a tightly controlled and organised agenda and coordination mechanism. So that's just a snapshot of what we believe is an emerging purpose ecosystem of multiple stakeholders and actors that are facilitating organisations to undertake business model innovation for sustainability, for transition towards the future fit society. We hope that our research begins the scholarly process of recognising the purpose ecosystem as a potentially critical enabler of wider systemic changes in light of other social science efforts such as the Earth System Governance Research Network. There's a dearth of empirical insights into how private actors are shaping the rules of global governance, particularly concerning socio-ecological trends. The UN Global Compact and Accenture recently called for the decade to deliver, highlighting business systemic change as key to influencing the broader business community to deliver real progress against the Sustainable Development Goals. The purpose ecosystem may provide such a systemic lever worthy of further examination. So thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure to share that with you, and I think we might have possibly some questions. Yes, Herman.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Very interesting and inspiring, and evokes a lot of thought. Quick question: have you thought about comparing this ecosystem with the other ecosystem, the one that supports profit-making businesses? and all the activity that goes into that ecosystem.
So you mean like the business as usual ecosystem?
Yeah. If you would view that as an ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and Fred and I pored over many long debates about how we describe and define an ecosystem. And, you know, obviously, you know, the papers that we've been submitting, that's what the reviewers have been talking about. So we actually haven't done that comparison. Of course, the business, what I'll call business as usual ecosystem is huge. And, you know, the stakeholders and actors in that is huge. So we really have just done that exploratory research to sort of, because we saw this emerging out of my B Corp research, actually. That's when we first sort of saying there's something going on here with all these people connecting, and B Lab, the certification body of B Corps being one of those. So we've, haven't really done any comparative analysis at this stage, but sounds like a good, quite big research project, Herman. Maybe that'd be something you could explore as the ecosystem for business, and we can do a comparison.
Yeah, it seems big, but it also seems very interesting, of course, to see, and also to gauge the potential if you see the interplay and the dynamics between these two ecosystems.
Yeah, I mean, there has been research done on sort of more formalized networks, business networks, and but again with a more formalized coordination. So yeah, I mean, and we have sort of looked a little bit at that research, but not in depth. But yeah, I think that would be interesting study to do. Thanks, Herman. So thank you, Julia, for your question about how would you delineate a purpose ecosystem. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by delineate, whether you mean define or whether you talk about the boundaries. The boundaries, okay. So this is another interesting question that Fred and I debated over, and we actually haven't defined the boundaries of the purpose ecosystem. We're actually allowing the ecosystem actors really to define the boundaries themselves. So because it's a very loosely coordinated, loosely connected, and in fact, when we first started talking to these actors, some of them weren't, they were aware of these other actors, but they hadn't started thinking about collaborating with them. And during our research and bringing these, we actually brought some of these actors together into a workshop. They started talking about more formal collaboration, because in some sense, some of them see each other as competitors. And I think, you know, there's this overriding sense that for them to have an impact, then there needs to be more collaboration and crossover. So in terms of defining the boundaries, we didn't actually put a boundary around it. We're actually interested to see how that emerges. And I think there's, again, another whole paper in that. So it's sort of rather malleable and changeable. There's a purpose ecosystem per specific problem to be solved, or is it mainly the collaboration and partnership in general? So these actors don't actually, they're not single problem type, they're not seeking to solve a particular problem. They tend to be looking at environmental and social issues. So they'll be looking at helping businesses identify what their social environmental issues are, and then how they can actually transform their businesses to address those issues and to reform their purpose around what those issues may well be. So, someone would like to answer this question live? Okay. Thanks for that. Sorry, there was one other question I think I need to go back to from Heidi, who asked for the 6 roles around a purpose ecosystem. On what level do you see this ecosystem? Is it worldwide, for a country, a community? So we actually didn't confine that we did look at, so we did a comparative analysis. We looked at what was emerging in the UK and what was emerging in Australia. So our research was, I suppose, geographic based, but it's a global thing. And some of the actors that we spoke to are global. So they operate in a lot of different countries. And some other actors are fairly country focused. But in fact, probably most of them we spoke to are global. So we don't sort of look at it on a geographic basis, even though the research that we did initially was geographic based, because we were looking at comparing what was happening in the UK and Australia. Kristen asks about how you view the viability of the purpose movement in a transition towards more sustainable businesses as compared to other external driving forces such as regulation or market drivers. Yeah, so this is an interesting one about these emerging forms of alternative governance mechanisms as opposed to regulation, because regulation is quite slow, whereas these businesses have just said we can't wait for regulation, we can't wait for governments to take a lead on this. Governments don't take a lead on this. Market drivers is an interesting one. We are actually seeing the impacts of these purpose ecosystem actors on market drivers. So we're seeing larger companies. If you listen to how some of the big companies now are talking about purpose, I mean, Unilever is a classic example, Paul Polman, for example. They're using some of this language that the smaller players have been using for many years around purpose-driven business. So I think the market drivers is an interesting thing to watch about whether this purpose ecosystem gets enough momentum and there's a tipping point. So we're starting to see some tipping points that the language that these purpose ecosystem actors are using are starting to push out into larger organisations. And of course, larger organisations have more clout, more power. And the other interesting thing we're seeing is the big consulting firms moving into this space. So for example, EY has a purpose practice, and we actually spoke to a partner who is part of her remit is partner in purpose, and she goes and consults to the CEOs of the big corporates around purpose and being purpose driven. So we're starting to see that penetrate. And so, in terms of market drivers, we may see that accelerating this notion of the purpose ecosystem or changing it. But I think the emerging other forms of governance are actually stepping into where government and regulation has not actually worked. And then Manon, I think this might be my final question, just to stay on time for your other exciting keynote. You talked about the strengths of the purpose ecosystem. Are there also downsides or challenges the purpose ecosystem is facing? Absolutely. And it's something we did explore about the barriers and the challenges to this, resources, lack of resources, and particularly when we talk to these purpose ecosystem actors, they're very passionate about wanting to drive purpose-driven business. And so, some of them have challenges around how do we make money out of this, because we actually want to help organisations. So resources. Lack of resources. Most of these are not big organisations. Most of them are not EYs. They're quite smaller organisations that connect in with each other, or they're actually set up as not-for-profits like B-Lab. They're set up as a not-for-profit, the certification body for B Corps, even though they've been spreading this purpose message. So yeah, there are lots of downsides and challenges, and probably don't have time to go through them all, but yes. So I think I've covered everything.
Det hon kanske klar? Okay, so you're done there. Wendy, thank you so much for your inspiration.
Thank you.
Wendy, thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to me. Have a great rest of the conference today.
Yeah, thank you. Now it's time to listen to Peter Wells from the UK. How are you, Peter?
Not bad. I'm enjoying a typical Welsh summer, which to say is very grey. But yeah, otherwise good. I've been enjoying the presentation from Wendy. That was interesting stuff.
Yeah,
I've missed rather more of this conference than I would have liked, but yeah, I've looked through the papers and it's a really vibrant, interesting community here. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this.
So you've had a good conference so far. Yeah, perfect. Take it away. It's all yours, Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Yes, well, compared to the previous presentation, not many pictures I've got for you, but yeah, I like to focus on kind of simple messages in a fairly fundamentalist way. And I think now is a good time for this particular group of researching academics to think about some of the more fundamental issues, particularly as they apply to business model innovation, new organizational forms, and so forth. And so, you know, it's great for me to be asked to do this by the organizing committee, and I thank them for that. And I'd like to share with you a very short presentation on the relationship between business model innovation community research on one side and the so-called sustainable transitions or sustainability transitions community on the other. And they are very much at different ends of the scale that we have on the one side, the kind of micro world of business, although as Wendy has clearly shown and as other papers have shown, people studying that area tend to look well beyond the boundaries of the firm anyway. And then on the other side, we've got the transitions people who are interested in the big picture and the long run changes and the way in which societies and economies shift massively like tectonic plates over time. So these are very different worlds, very different ways of thinking about the world and thinking about change, but increasingly like one side and the other side coming together. And that's really what I'd like to talk about. So I'll share a screen for a moment to pop up a quick presentation. So as you can see, I mean, I freed Nelson Mandela. Now, if you cast your minds back, I mean, a lot of you well too young, but early 1980s, I was involved in a lot of demonstrations and activities around anti-apartheid, rock against racism, and quite a few other things as well, I have to say. The anti-cruise missile campaigns, the so-called convoy movement in the UK, which is about kind of new age travelers protesting, mostly against Margaret Thatcher and related to kind of right-wing conservative government activities. And one of them was the campaign with the anti-apartheid community to fight against, well, basically against all sorts of pressures and changes that we see not quite going on fast enough. So I think, you know, what we learned from that was, in some cases, these mass demonstrations really make a difference, but in some cases they don't. I mean, I was also involved in one of the UK's largest ever peacetime demonstrations, which was the protest against the Blair government and their plan to go into the Iraq war on some very tenuous evidence on the weapons of mass destruction. And it's a huge demonstration, well over 500,000 people in central London. And yet nothing happened. On the other hand, I definitely freed Nelson Mandela, because being involved in all of those demonstrations, being involved in all of those activities, for example, militant shopping, that was a good one. I don't know if you ever tried this. What you do is you go into a supermarket or other retail destination of your choice, and then we would go through and pick out all the products that were associated with apartheid, either because the company was active there or because the products came from South Africa. You pile them all into the shopping trolley, take the shopping trolley to the checkout, let the checkout people put it through the system, and then just walk away. Used to drive people mad. But there you go, that's militant shopping. And these kind of activities were part and parcel of a much bigger set of changes. And I think that's really the message here, that how do we disentangle your individual efforts or the individual efforts of companies, organizations, government agencies, whatever they may be, how are those individual efforts to be understood within these bigger processes of social change. And that's a very hard thing to trace in terms of cause and effect. And I think this is the challenge facing now the business model innovation community. What we see is a lot of interesting work going on around business model innovation, but where's the cause and effect? Dead as a door. Who knows how to move this slide on? I'm afraid the slide has died on me. Yeah, there we go. Very slow. So I've flagged up these 3 questions. We've got the individual events. To me, they are like flowers in the desert after it's rained. You get this lovely flourishing of flowers and then nothing. And so what do we do with these flowers in the desert? How do we know whether they're part of a bigger picture of change? Then we've got these big shifts in society. And are they making a difference? What's driving change here? Is it the big changes in society pushing against the organizations, or is it organizations individually pushing change in society? And how do those 2 things interrelate? And so fundamentally, the question is, all this business model innovation, does it actually give us progress? Are things getting better as a result? Personally, I'm deeply suspicious of business model innovations around the circular economy, for example, because it seems to me very easy for that to slip into a justification for continued mass consumption, overconsumption of many products and services. And all it's doing really is increasing the velocity of circulation in the material economy. And I don't see that as being particularly progress. But until we see some connection between these kind of isolated islands of innovation and these bigger picture issues, then it's very hard to say whether I'm right or wrong on those. So I think there's a lot of big new challenges. This is my illustration of the challenges. So, we have on the right-hand side, actually that's God, for what it's worth, but on the right-hand side, we have the kind of transitions community. On the left-hand side, obviously representing Florian, we have business model innovation community, and we're looking for that spark, that moment where we can bring those 2 things together. And I think once you get to that point, you're in a position to be able to say whether or not significant change is happening. We've got a book, I'm going to plug it. I don't usually do this, to be honest, but we've created this book. Mostly it came out of initiatives from Annabeth and Florian, and they asked me to join later. But the book is really trying to set the first few steps, in a way, in this journey to try to create an integration between these 2 areas of research. And it was very interesting to see what came out of it. Many of the authors are also represented in this conference, and it wasn't a genuine attempt to bring together 2 diverse communities. The danger with this is you always kind of fall outside of both. And I think that's always a risk for any academic doing research of this type, that you're not sufficiently grounded in one set of literatures and research and so on, that you cannot sufficiently convince people working in that area that you have something to contribute. And I think in this case, we've managed to at least to chart the beginnings of a research agenda and a research direction that could genuinely be useful. Just in case you're not so familiar with the transitions world, but generally speaking, the transitions community focuses on some very core key systems, food, transportation, energy, that kind of thing. They miss a lot of things. I mean, I've noticed, for example, that in the business model literature and in this conference, there's some really interesting papers on clothing. Sustainability transitions community hasn't really thought about clothing or any of that, which is an interesting gap. So there's not an exact match between what transitions scholars have been working on and what that community is interested in, and the kind of work that the business model innovation community has been doing either. That kind of gap, I think, is both interesting and potentially exploitable. Transitions, therefore, very much focuses on all of the ensemble. The kind of ecosystem that Wendy was talking about is part of that story. And as we get interested in how business relates to other parts of the society, so you kind of build out into the world of transitions research. But it's also interested in sustainability transitions are very much about the long-term shifts. Some of the original work in this area, they considered periods of change of up to sort of 70, 80, 90 years. And again, for us, I think that's probably too long, but we have to understand that in many respects, some parts of society, some aspects of society change very slowly. I think we have a kind of cultural bias towards innovation and change, and we tend not to see things that don't change. We don't tend to see those things as so important or to understand them as significant. So I've highlighted a couple of interesting papers to have a look at there. I mean, this kind of idea of a research agenda keeps on coming up. And I think one of the things that's going to happen next in terms of the research agenda for transitions community is to expand the scope of what they consider to be worthy of areas of investigation in terms of things like new types of technology not usually covered in transitions, and in terms of the activities of other actors, particularly, of course, the business community, finance, and areas like that. And in this book, I think we learned some lessons. Yeah, a good thing, it's always a good thing to end up with more questions than answers. In the interest of job creation, we always need to find new research. But I think more seriously, I don't think there's a whole bunch of things that we haven't thought enough about. Not only do we focus too much on innovation, we tend to focus too much on the kind of good news, the positive side of the story. We don't think enough about the things that are not going well, the things that are kind of bad as we see them in one way and another. So, for example, we don't think about how business model innovation might actually constrain transitions towards sustainability. I suspect quite a lot of platform innovation, for example, in terms of business organization, contribute towards a resistance against transition, because they often accelerate the ability to consume. And so we're producing more, we're consuming more, we're wasting more, and platforms just make that easier. So I think we need to think about those kind of issues. Maybe actually this whole socio-technical system constrains the ability to change. Again, we have to think about these kind of things and perhaps integrate them more carefully into our research. So we have these two areas sort of slowly but surely coming together. And what we tried to do in the book was develop a simple framework to try to understand that. And this is kind of what it is. This is the spiral diagram. We have some debate about this diagram, I have to say. You have to kind of balance out the need for clarity and simplicity with the kind of comprehensiveness of the message. And whenever you put a diagram up in front of somebody, then the critiques kind of pile in. So relax, don't worry too much about it. But this is where we're trying to go with this. Now, what we try to do is have those kind of three basic levels: micro, meso, and macro, and to think about the passage of time. It's clearly integrating time into this analysis. So I think this is something we all tend to do insufficiently. Maybe it's just the passing of the years. I've been at this so long. But I just feel that we don't really think enough about the pace of change. How fast are we doing something, and how quickly are we doing something? Now, increasingly, of course, the scientific community is telling us that we have less and less time available to make the kind of changes we need to make in terms of climate change, resource consumption, etc. Those planetary boundaries are being pushed further and further out. The most recent one being, I think nitrogen's now gone well past its limit. And just reading that last year, methane levels were suddenly very, very high, and there's no clear explanation as to why. So things are going on around us. Time is therefore very important, and the ability to kind of think about that and integrate that into our studies is very important. So we've got the kind of idea that micro level changes feed up through the kind of ecosystems that Wendy was talking about, through those wider networks and linkages. At the same time, the system as a whole feeds back down, both in terms of cultural changes in society and hard regulatory and governance changes to help shape that change process. So we have both things acting together. So on the one hand, we've got these big transitions coming out of all of these different factors. And on the other hand, we've got businesses as the kind of predominant mode of resource allocation. And we're trying to marry those two up. The question is whether that's genuinely possible. And I'm still a bit ambiguous on that one. Then we need to think a little bit more about what is the role of academia in all of this? I mean, there's a lot of emphasis nowadays on academics being generally useful, shall we say, making an impact, contributing to solutions, being participants in the process. And of course, there's many benefits from that. But equally, there are some risks. Not least, I think there's a danger that we get sucked into more immediate problem solving. We get sucked into ameliorating the worst excesses of the current situation without taking the time to think about the more innovative solutions for the future. But I do see, even within this conference, there's a lot of really interesting work going on that could be contributory to a more radical and more interesting and more survivable future. I'm a big fan of kind of business model design, and academics can do this. Too often, I think, we are historians. We sit and we watch the world, and it's business that innovates, or it's other organizations that innovate, and we totter along afterwards. We measure, we collate, we talk to people, we provide frameworks and so on, but we are historians. We are simply telling the story of what happened in the past. Maybe we need to be more forward-looking, more engaged in putting our necks out and saying, look, this is what we could do, even if nobody's yet doing it. And that's going to be important because, you know, there's going to be a lot of experimentation. This was clear from the presentations in the conference so far. There's a huge amount of experimentation going on. And interestingly enough, experimentation is exactly where sustainable transitions and the business model innovation community really come together. Within the sustainable transitions world, this idea of niches within which experimentation happens and social learning happens is key to allowing replacement of an existing regime, an existing structure which is unsustainable. So those little niches where experimentation happens are precisely the homes where business model innovation happens. What we need to be able to do, therefore, is to show how this kind of innovation, no matter how small scale or how large, how that innovation connects to the sustainability transition. So I can see there's a lot more room for research, which is good. I think there's a bunch of things that came out of this conference which are kind of relevant. I can see that in some respects there's overlap in the area studied, for example. Some people are researching things like business model innovation in food systems or in energy, in related areas that are already heavily covered by the transitions literature. So that's a relatively straightforward join to make. In some cases, the innovation in terms of business model innovation literature is much more interested in a wider range of activities, fashion, packaging, use of plastics, all sorts of stuff are in this conference as examples of really interesting bits of work that haven't yet got a kind of cousin, a match against the sustainable transitions community. So I think that there's some interesting opportunities there, and that's something that could be exploited further into the future. One thing I don't see happening much is a more kind of critical perspective on business model innovation for sustainability. There's kind of an assumption that if it's good on a micro scale, it's going to be good on a big scale. I don't think that's a safe assumption. I don't see enough of a connection to these bigger debates in society around green growth, degrowth, the relationship between production and consumption. Those more kind of critical perspectives, I think, are probably something that's quite needed in the business model innovation literature. And that's why I've kind of flagged up this paper by Johann Schrott and his colleague, looking at these so-called deep transitions. Because this really starts to question whether or not capitalism fundamentally is able to deliver us into some form of more sustainable the future. I hear what Wendy says. She had a really interesting presentation and strong case around the importance of these organizations in helping us to deliver a more sustainable future. But fundamentally, capitalism is a growth-orientated beast. It's an innovation. We created capitalism. We can uncreate it. But we have to ask ourselves, is business model innovation the solution to these problems, or merely taking some of the worst edges off? So I'd like to see much more work in that kind of area. And I think from the other side, from the transitions community, there needs to be a much greater appreciation of the role of business model innovation, amongst other things, within these kind of ecosystems and within these supply chains and within these networks of social actors, to understand how far the pace of change can change. Because that is our key need. We really need to do something about the pace of change. Okay, well, I think I'll kind of leave it there. I'm up for questions. Stony silence. I could also, of course, talk all morning, but that's another story altogether. If you didn't have any questions, I would suggest you rush out and buy the book, which will be available soon. It's actually not available yet, but it will be available soon. And there's a very nice intro to the area. And take a look at some of the transitions community's work. Their main journal is the EIST, Environmental Innovations and Sustainable Transitions.
Okay, Peter, thank you so much for your insightful keynote. I'm, of course, buying the book.
Sorry, I have a question.
You have a question, please. Carry on.
Hi, I'm Herman. I'm just wondering, when you wanted to marry together the micro and the macro, did you consider other macro perspectives on macro level change other than socio-tech transition?
Of course, there's a wide range of potential kind of theoretical perspectives. So yeah, that's a fair question. Well, I think basically the transitions community is very much focused on innovation, technological innovation originally, and its relationship between economic growth. And so that seemed to me a very good connecting starting point for linking to the business studies, organizational studies community, which also often has that focus on innovation and at a micro level, economic growth. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly other big discourses that one could engage with. And I think probably there are some more political discourses one could engage with other than the transitions community. But what the explicit integration of a systems perspective with that focus on innovation, I think is extremely helpful to understanding the role of business in processes of change at a macro level when you're looking at the micro level changes.
Okay, thank you.
Q&As, I don't know.
Have a nice
I don't know if any of those are relevant. Can I just have a quick look at the Q&As before you go?
Yeah, please.
Thank you, madam. She runs a tight ship. Can you expand on the role of digital technologies in increasing the change direction? Yeah, well, the relationship between digital technologies and the pace of change, I think, is probably key to this into the future, because it's possible to make significant structural adjustments and system changes via the integration of digital technologies, all the way from kind of community technologies like Facebook to supply chain type technologies like blockchain. So I do see that as being a significant potential change in a good direction, and it will help. Mark, I haven't seen you for ages, Mark. He's got a question on experimentation as a joint concept in transition and business model innovation. Which experiment do you see as an example of interesting high potential for learning about sustainable transitions? Oh, that's a very good question. Well, for me, I mean, I have a personal interest in these issues, of course, as well. But for me, some of the interesting innovations in terms of business models are in those business models which challenge existing forms of governance. And so, you know, I've got my own case that I've looked at in the form of River Simple, which is a micro mobility company. But they, you know, where they're actually not just thinking about the performance of the product and so forth, but changing the way that the business itself operates in a manner to try to remove that profit maximizing incentive, I think is a crucial first step, because then you build that the kind of network, the ecosystem that Wendy was talking about, on the premise that you're not just trying to maximize profits, you're trying to give equal weight to everybody. Do I have enough time for one more?
No, you don't.
There you go. She runs a very tight ship.
I'm
Okay,
very harsh.
yeah, no worries, no worries.
Thank you anyways.
Yeah, people are more than welcome to email me, and
Yeah,
and
we can
obviously
email each other and keep asking. Yeah.
keep in touch. All right.
Okay. Thank you so much. Now we need a break, don't we? And we see you back here after the sessions.